Welcome to Stimson's seminar on the webinar, well, hybrid event of U.S. Japan Alliance called U.S. Japan Alliance from Peace and Prosperity in the Indo-Pacific to a Global Partnership. This is kind of a fun event that I'm excited that I was able to put together. We know each other for decades, first of all. That brings the fun into it. Not that many, but there definitely was S there, though. But more importantly, these two gentlemen played a very important role as both countries' policy toward Asia-Pacific evolved and alliance evolved. And that started back in 1997 when these two were direct counterpart with each other. So, to many of you, these two don't really need much introduction, but let me go through really quickly. Immediately to my right is Ambassador Derek Mitchell. He's a senior advisor, non-resident at CSIS, but before then, he was the U.S. ambassador to Myanmar after U.S. Normalized their relationship with Myanmar. Renormalized, I guess. And then next to him is Mr. Masami Oka. He just came out of the government after he served over 30 years, and his last position was the Vice Defense Minister for International Affairs, so he was kind of overseeing Japan's defense diplomacy from the JMOD for a long time. And they're also grad school alums. They're both from Fletcher. That kind of hurts as a SICE grad, but we'll see how this goes. And last but not least, my name is Yuki Tatsumi. I'm a director of Japan program and co-director of East Asia here at Stimson. So the way it works, I'd like to start this conversation by posing 3 opening questions to these two, and then I'll go into the question and answer with the rest of you, including here on the floor and those of you who are joining us online. However, for those of you who are here, please do go to use this website link that you can find on your chair to pose your question. That way it can everything comes to this fancy little iPad that I have so that I won't miss any of your questions. So, morning.
Morning.
So like we were chatting a little bit earlier, it's been almost 30 years since you two directly worked together to revise the U.S. Japan guidelines for defense cooperation. So from that time and the way that alliance works and functions now, what do you think changed most greatly? So I'll start with Oka-san, and I'll ask for Derek for any additional comment.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the, first of all, kind and generous introduction for us. And I would also like to appreciate the support of the Stimson Center for the alliance between Japan and the United States. And also, I would like to express my deep appreciation for Yuki Tatsumi and her colleagues and staffs who organized this opportunity. It's a great pleasure for me to have a chance to be present here this morning, and I'm very much looking forward to a lively discussion with participants both here as well as online. And let me start to try to respond to the first question from Yuki, and perhaps I might touch very briefly on the evolution of the alliance cooperation between Japan and the United States. During the Cold War era, the intention on the part of Japan is to make sure, as part of the Western countries, not to make any void of power or something like that, that could lead to some kind of contingencies. So, with regard to the defense cooperation between the two sides, there was what was called the guidelines for Japan-U.S. defense cooperation of 1978. And there are 3 sections there. First one is posture for deterring aggression. Second one, actions in response to an armed attack against Japan. And third section of the guidelines was called Japan-U.S. cooperation in the case of situations in the Far East, outside of Japan, which will have an important influence on the security of Japan. So there are those 3 sections in the very first defense guidelines, But this is just my personal impression, but the major focus of the efforts was on the possible cooperation in response to a potential armed attack against Japan. So we are kind of talking about, in the context of the bilateral discussion, how we are going to cooperate together in response to an armed attack against Japan. But after the end of the Cold War, there were a lot of discussions, particularly among academics, journalists, and so on. And some people are talking about the alliance adrift. You know, after the end of the Cold War, people are trying to adjust defense and security policy to sort of respond to emerging security environment and emerging security agendas and so on. And I was a very young action officer back then, and we are seriously discussing, even between the governments, how we are going to adjust and update our alliance so that we could respond most effectively to the emerging security environment. And one thing I might touch upon is the Joint Security Declaration, Japan-U.S. Joint Security Declaration of 1996. And this declaration, and let me quote, they reaffirmed, they means the Prime Minister and the President, they reaffirmed that the Japan-U.S. security relationship based on the Treaty of Mutual Cooperation and Security between Japan and the United States of America remains the cornerstone for achieving common security objectives and for maintaining a stable and prosperous environment for the Asia-Pacific region as we enter the 21st century. So against such backdrop, the joint declaration went on to articulate bilateral cooperation under the Japan-U.S. security relationship, regional cooperation, and global cooperation. And in this joint declaration, the top leaders directed us, the government officials, to initiate the review of the 97 guidelines for Japan-U.S. defense cooperation, which I touched upon a little bit earlier. And let me see. The intention is to build upon the cross-working relationship already established between Japan and the United States. And the declaration went on to say the two leaders agreed on the necessity to promote bilateral policy coordination, including studies on bilateral cooperation in dealing with situations that may emerge in the area surrounding Japan and which will have an important influence on the peace and security of Japan. So there were a lot of hard works between the government officials between the two sides, which resulted in the announcement of the completion of the review by the 2+2 meeting in September 1997. There were a lot of areas which were touched upon and introduced in the new defense guidelines, and, but perhaps most notably the concept of what we call SIAS-J, which, or cooperation in situations in areas surrounding Japan that will have an important influence on Japan's peace and security. So this is a kind of a very rough sketch of development right after the end of the Cold War to readjust our policy to come up with the new defense guidelines of 1997. And, you know, even after that, there were continued efforts to reorient and adjust or update or modernize whatever language you might use to make sure that this alliance could effectively respond to a newly emerging security environment. Just for the sake of example, in 2015, our government introduced a new legislation for peace and security. And 2015 is also a year when the updated defense guidelines was also adopted between the two governments. And the major focus, or one of the major agendas for this update was to ensure seamless response to situations throughout all phases from peacetime to contingencies. And in 2022, the United States released its new national security strategy, and we, on the part of Japan, in December 2022, we adopted new security strategies and defense strategies. And against such background, there was what we call 2+2 meeting in January 2023, which confirmed unprecedented alignment of the vision, priorities, and goals, which form a solid foundation for their efforts to constantly modernize the alliance in order to address the increasingly severe security environment. So this is a very, very, very rough sketch of the development and evolution of this alliance cooperation. But you know, things are kind of evolving and developing step by step, responding to the security environment. So it's a kind of a little bit difficult to identify something specific as one of the major difference between what we had back then, I mean, back in like at the end of the Cold War and now. But because, you know, I think it's very much dependent on what kind of rebels you are and what kind of perspectives you have. And based on those things, answer might be a little bit different. But let me try from my own personal views. There are a lot of differences, probably, a lot of new concepts introduced. But one thing I might touch upon is the importance of coordination, policy and operational cooperation between the two sides. And in fact, I touched upon the 2015 defense guidelines between the two countries. And one of the things introduced in that guidelines was called Alliance Coordination Mechanism. And I think that's a kind of a very new, important development to enhance the bilateral and, for that matter, multilateral coordination between the two governments, between the two sides. And on the Japanese side, we thought it very important to involve a full-of-government approach to make sure that we can most effectively cooperate with the U.S. side. And let me just give you a little bit of background from my own perspective why we are working on this coordination issue. In 2011, in Japan, there was what we called Great East Japan Earthquake, and the U.S. forces and U.S. government cooperated and supported the efforts on the part of Japan significantly, and we highly appreciate that. You might have heard about the operations Tomodachi by the U.S. forces in Japan to support the humanitarian assistance and disaster relief type operations. But in order to do that, there was a huge amount of coordination between Japan Ministry of Defense, Japan Self-Defense Forces, and U.S. side. And we did establish coordination centers in Ichigaya, which is the headquarters of the MOD, and in Yokota, which is the headquarters of the U.S. Forces Japan, and also in Sendai, which is a major city in the Tohoku area, northeastern part of Japan. And a lot of coordination were required, and we found them very effective in terms of effectively conducting HADR-type operations. And in, I think in June 2011, there was another 2+2 meeting. Back then, I was the director of the Japan-US Defense Cooperation Division. And one of the documents adopted in this 2+2 meeting was kind of a lessons learned type document based on our own experiences during the response to the Great East Japan earthquake, as well as the, for that matter, the nuclear incident in Fukushima. And, you know, this document, at least in my mind, touches on the very importance of coordination between the two sides, how to make sure that we can effectively coordinate with each other so that we could make most effective use of this alliance cooperation to respond to situations. And I think that's kind of one aspect which I would like to touch upon to respond to the very first question from Yuki. Let me stop here.
Thank you. And then you just ran us through the whole history of the last almost 30 years of a U.S.-Japan alliance, which was great. Derek, especially you too, you know, you were in the pivotal place where USG, Pentagon came up with the East Asia Strategy Report as well. So from that vantage point, and you've been always involved in the U.S. strategy formulation for Asia. So.
Right. Well, thank you, Yuki. Thank you, Stimson. Thank you, of course, Yuki, my old colleague, and Masami Oka, my old colleague as well. We're not that old, but we're getting older every day. It's wonderful to talk about the alliance, and I thought Oka-san made a great presentation giving kind of a comprehensive view of the development over the past 25, 30 years, since 97, really 96 and before. Just to supplement on a few points. First of all, it's interesting, you mentioned the guidelines, you've mentioned 96. The guidelines, there were several iterations of the guidelines. First iterations of the East Asia Strategy Report. The East Asia Strategy Initiative in 1990, then a 92 report. I actually did the 98 report. There was a 95 report that was under Joseph Nye, and the so-called Nye Initiative under 95 in those days. People remember back to the 90s, there was a fundamental question, I think, as you indicated. Should there be an alliance? What's the purpose of the alliance? Why do we have a U.S.-Japan alliance at all? Cold War is over. Why do we need to have forces in Asia? We should come home. There's a peace dividend, et cetera, et cetera. The ones who were driving at the time the idea that we needed to remain focused and continue to pursue the alliance structure, and particularly the U.S.-Japan alliance at the core, Joe Nye led that, Kirk Campbell led that, was the Pentagon, was DOD. It was viewed as very much a security-focused relationship, a military alliance relationship. When I was in the Clinton administration in the late 90s, during the time of the guidelines, et cetera, we used to kind of say, well, look, State Department does Korea, White House does China, the DOD does Japan. Those kind of, that's where they kind of naturally divided. White House wanted to build this new relationship to avoid a new Cold War with the rise of China. We had the Korea crisis in the 90s, and the State Department had initiatives to do diplomatic sort of containment of that problem. And DOD, where I happened to be stationed or placed as a political appointee, that happened to be the center of alliance management. But it was really DOD-centered. It was, and for years, was defense-centered. A major difference today is you see this is a government-wide kind of initiative. The alliance is now truly whole of government. You certainly see that under Biden. I think there was moves towards that under Obama, maybe some under Trump. I didn't know so many things going on with Trump, but there were things that evolved in the Trump years too that I think moved things along. But one fundamental change, a big one when it comes to the U.S. government, was that this is really viewed as a whole of government necessity. Why? What's changed? Things have gotten real. I mean, back in the 90s, we had in 96, when we had the joint agreement by the president and prime minister, but then also the 97 guidelines was a response to the Taiwan crisis of 97. So there was a crisis in the Taiwan Straits where we had to move U.S. aircraft carriers around the strait, near the strait, to ward off the Chinese missiles that were firing over as Taiwan held its first presidential election. So when it was talked about situations in areas surrounding Japan, that was a euphemism in part for Taiwan and, of course, for North Korea, if there were fighting in that area, and how Japan would be, and our forces in Japan should be thinking about our roles and missions under those contingencies. To the Defense Department, it was getting somewhat real then, but to Japan at the time, to be honest, there was always a bit of pushing and pulling. I think defense understood it. There were probably people within the system that got it, but that the sort of the peace, the instinct towards peace and self-defense and all that was still pretty well embedded. And in MOFA, the China school was very well embedded within there too, of we need to engage China. You couldn't even talk about China with the Japanese at the time easily, because it was kind of off limits. That obviously has completely changed, and because things have gotten real, and Japan knows what happens is going to affect them directly. The other issue, and this is why we know each other so well, we worked together on the guidelines. We were talking, reminiscing last night and this morning about being in the embassy here together at 2 in the morning, working on the final wording of the guidelines in 97. But that was emblematic of most of the alliance was based on management of the alliance itself. It's internally focused. How do we make sure Okinawa stays stable? We don't talk, Okinawa is mentioned still, it's still being worked, but that used to dominate the alliance. It was existential almost if there was a problem in Okinawa. Now, the alliance is talking about big issues. We're talking about major geopolitical issues because those issues have gotten real, and we're not just talking about them in Asia, we're talking about them globally. And the final thing I'll say that really is very different, I would say, from the Japan side, is Japan is proactive. They are coming up with the ideas. Instead of the gaiatsu of, well, we ought to, and I think Japan always had ideas, and you would basically tell us to do something because we can't do it. We need gaiatsu to get us able to do it in our system. But now, you think of the Quad, think of the free and open Indo-Pacific, these are Japanese ideas. Japan is drawing us along quietly, with humility as Japan does it. They're coming up with, they're proactive, they're reaching out to the Philippines, they're reaching out to Vietnam, they're reaching out in Southeast Asia, they're doing things in Ukraine. This is the alliance, frankly, that we dreamed of years ago, that we wanted Japan to be a more equal partner in this, even as Japan has, and I think what has sustained, what is most important, is that what has sustained the relationship, which is the fact that Japan continues to support U.S. forces, continues to support U.S. force presence. And that remains, I would say, the cornerstone of regional stability and security. Without Japanese support for the United States in Asia and in Northeast Asia and in Japan, we couldn't possibly have the deterrent effect, and it's obviously growing and expanding. We couldn't possibly play the role of guarantor and balancer, regional balancer, that is becoming more and more precarious by the day. So we owe, as Americans, I hope we are more aware of the importance of the U.S.-Japan relationship, but if not, we owe an incredible debt of gratitude to people like Masami Oka and those who worked over decades to keep this relationship strong.
Thank you both. So this next question, I think, is maybe a little bit more toward Oka-san. So as you just gave us a really rich perspective of the history of the alliance, at the same time, as we're well aware, Japan's own national security policy evolved along with it. And in particular, in recent years, Tokyo has been really strengthening its engagement with its partners in Southeast Asia, Australia, India, Europe, and then also, finally, it's Tokyo's relationship with Seoul seemed to got back on track as well. So what are some of the drivers that encourages or incentivize Japan to go into that direction?
Well, thank you very much for this very important question. And perhaps let me start with some of the official position of the government of Japan, which is incorporated in our National Defense Strategy of 2022. In this strategic document, this strategic defense strategy identified 3 objectives of defense and 3 approaches to realize those objectives. And those 3 objectives include, first, to fundamentally reinforce Japan's defense capabilities and to reinforce the defense architecture of the whole country. And the second approach is to further reinforce joint deterrence and response capabilities of the Japan-US alliance by further strengthening cooperation with the United States. And the third approach is to reinforce collaboration with like-minded countries and others with whom Japan cooperate to uphold and reinforce a free and open international order. And looking at the evolving security environment, particularly after the Russian invasion against Ukraine, I think we feel that those evolving security environment has underscored the increasing importance of aligning with as many countries as possible in order to ensure peace and stability in the security environment. And, it will be very important. We have to pay due attention to the characteristics or circumstances of potential partners and the regional implications and so on, particularly when we are kind of collaborating with ASEAN countries, for example, because they have some difference of views and nuances of our positions and so on. But while paying due attention to those kind of things, we are planning to promote defense cooperation and exchanges with various countries in a multifaceted and multi-layered manner That's a kind of the language we are using when we are talking about our approach to the international community. And we believe those efforts in the defense field will be very much aligned with and conducive to the vision of FOIP, Free and Open Indo-Pacific, Derek mentioned earlier as well. And in the Indo-Pacific region, we have been engaged in a lot of initiatives for defense cooperation and exchanges with countries in the region. And those initiatives include not only bilateral relations, but also trilateral, quadrilateral, and multilateral relationship as well. So sometimes it's very complicated. And I was working as Vice Minister of Defense for International Affairs for 1 year. But during the course of that 1 year, I did have a chance to take part in a lot of engagements through bilateral, multilateral, or trilateral, and other types of minilateral opportunities. But we have to make most effective use of those engagements so that those initiatives and efforts would contribute to peace and stability in the world as well as in the international community. And while working upon various partnership and practical cooperation, we maintain close coordination with the United States as an ally and with other like-minded countries, so that our efforts would make further contributions to peace and stability in the region. Let me perhaps talk a little bit about our relationship with Australia, for example. We have a special strategic partnership with them, and we updated our joint security declaration, and the new one was adopted in October 2022 on the occasion of our Prime Minister's visit to Perth, Australia. And if I may quote one sentence from that declaration, our bilateral partnership also reinforces our respective alliances with the United States that serve as critical pillars for our security as well as for peace and stability of the Indo-Pacific. And I may also touch upon our relationship with United Kingdom as a kind of a representative of the European countries in what I am going to talk about. And we had what we call Hiroshima Accord, which was released on the occasion of the G7 summit meeting in Hiroshima last year. And again, a quote of one sentence from that Hiroshima Accord, recognizing that the security and prosperity of the Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific are inseparable, we will strengthen our shared security capabilities to help safeguard global peace and stability. And in November last year, there was a 2+2 meeting between Japan and the United Kingdom. And let me quote one sentence again. The four ministers concurred on the importance of reinforcing coordination with their common ally, the United States, and partners in further reinforcing their ability to address security challenges. So, while we are approaching a lot of different countries, we also feel that it would be important for us to make sure that those kind of multi-layered and multifaceted approach, while we are talking with European countries, we are thinking about our relationship with the United States, for example, and those kinds of interlocking frameworks, we believe, would be making a lot of contributions to peace and stability in the region. And, with regard to ASEAN countries, I did have an opportunity to invite my counterparts from ASEAN member countries to have a vice ministerial meeting in Tokyo. And that was a very good opportunity for us to interact with them multilaterally. But we also had a lot of interactions bilaterally with them as well. And this week, we have a meeting in Tokyo, what we call JPID, which stands for, let's see, Japan Pacific Islands Defense Dialogue. And this is a ministerial level meeting. We invited ministerial level representatives from Pacific Islands to Tokyo. This is a very first face-to-face meeting. The first one was online because of the corona pandemic. But we do feel that in order to contribute to the peace and stability in the region, as well as to realize the principles of FOIP, it would be important, even in the defense side, to have a lot of interactions with the Pacific Island countries. But while we are doing that, we are also coordinating closely with the United States government and Australian and New Zealanders and so on. So, we have to look at various aspects of the different types of frameworks so that we could make most effective use of those initiatives. Let me stop here and.
So Derek, especially Japan's this engagement is actively going on. You were actually in Southeast Asia. So how does it look from that perspective?
Well, when I was ambassador in Myanmar, my instincts, because I was forged in the Pentagon on the U.S. Japan relationship and on the desk, is everything I thought about was how can the U.S. and Japan work together there. And we didn't quite work as well as I would have liked to. I coordinated where I could, and I shared information and such. But I do think, as Masami-san said, that what Japan is doing is absolutely consistent with the alliance, and it's consistent with what we'd like to see, which is we would like to see Japan do more with third countries. We'd like to see the U.S.-Japan alliance be a U.S.-Japan plus kind of arrangement. So it's U.S.-Japan and the Philippines, U.S.-Japan and Australia, U.S.-Japan and the Quad, U.S.-Japan and U.K., or whatever it is. And now you hear, of course, NATO and Japan are having good cooperation and becomes a global alliance dealing with what is a global challenge to all of us. So Japan is an equal partner, is a partner with us on working on the leading challenges in the world and bringing the tremendous resources that Japan has to bear. So it could be development resources, it could be infrastructure resources. In Ukraine, it's reconstruction, or in Pacific Islands, it could be similar, technologies, and so all of that is a force multiplier. And again, I think today more and more it's being inculcated within the diplomatic bureaucracy. It's not just limited to sort of the Pentagon, where a small club of people are interested in the alliance, and so they're working to maintain it and broaden it. Now I think it's becoming ingrained that in everyone that we need to be working with Japan on everything where we can. Africa is another location where if you look at, I love the fact that the Biden administration is finally taking on the idea that the history of the 21st century, much of it is going to be written in Asia. I'm an Asianist. I love that. Finally, the U.S. government is taking on Asia and looking at it as a priority. And then I worked on the globe in my previous job as president of the National Democratic Institute, which works on democracy worldwide. And I realized I think that's kind of half right. I don't think Asia is going to be, Asia is going to be important, but Africa, if you look at the demographics and the dynamism, I think the second half of the 21st century at least, a lot of the history is going to be written in Africa, and a lot of it in the next 20, 25 years as well. Japan has historic investment and other business relationships there. We can be thinking about what more can we do in Africa or in Eastern Europe and other places, not just in Asia, to ensure that we are shaping the type of world we all want to live in and want to thrive in, and that we are all players in that. That America is not the hyperpower that can do it alone anymore. We need our allies. So the more Japan is out there doing that and shaping and promoting certain development ideas and norms and such, it works for us. I think the things that can be done, information sharing, I know we're doing now the surveillance, reconnaissance, real-time information sharing agreement with the Koreans. You're working on something with the Italians and the Brits on the next generation fighter aircraft, which is not necessarily against the interest of us in the West. And we need to be doing more on the countering economic coercion, not just military coercion, but economic coercion that's going on around the world with China, frankly, using economic means. We need to be working on semiconductors together. There are all these things that we can be leveraging our partners in Asia and in Europe and elsewhere to be maximizing our respective interests. So I do think this is a force multiplier to us. The final thing I'll say on this is that I also think it's symbolically very important. The more that what happens, the more China becomes assertive and aggressive, the more it gets Japan out of its self-imposed sort of restrictions and pushes Korea and Japan and the United States together. You see more of Japan in the region, ROK in the region, Europe integrated. That sends a signal to China that what they're doing is counterproductive. And that if they certainly don't like any of this. They hate the alliance system. I mean, they've been on us for the last 30 years or more of military presence is provocative. They still do it in their global security initiative, different terms for it over the past 30 years. The latest is that. Used to call it the new security concept, but alliances are bad and military presence is bad. It's all provocative. That tells you what they're concerned about and what they fear. And we could take some of that. We don't want to have a conflict with China. It's not our purpose. But the rest of the region wants that preserved because they realize a rising China is going to come. If there isn't anything to balance it, it's going to come in a hegemonic price. So the signal that Japan is now doing all this, that when it breaks out and talks a bit more about collective self-defense in oblique terms, does counter-strike capability ideas. And then there's not much of a reaction from the Japanese public. The Japanese public says, well, maybe this is where we need to go. It's remarkable. 10 years ago, you wouldn't have seen that, and yet you're starting to see it now. And that signal is very, very important if we want to send a deterrent signal to the Chinese that if you do what you look like you want to do, that's going to come at a price.
Hearing you talk about all this reminds me, how the word situation in the area surrounding Japan's Tire Strait came out in the first place. So it is a change from back in the day, right?
Yeah, situational.
And then both of you alluded to, so this is a perfect way to end my opening question to both of you. So like both of you alluded to, today's world faces a lot of crises, two simultaneous kinetic conflicts in Europe and Middle East. And also President Biden referred to the importance of peace and stability across Taiwan Strait in a State of Union address. I can't recall at the State of Union address, that situation was really spoken that, explicitly. So in all this, what do you think is the role that U.S. Japan alliance can play to preserve? I think, kind of goes kind of more related to what you just said. So I'll come to you first, and then I'll ask Oka-san to have a last word on this.
No, as I say, I think I laid out a lot of that. We have a summit coming up, we forget. We've had a series of U.S. Asia summits, Korea, India, and we could have Japan. I think that's all, again, symbolic and sends a signal that this remains the cornerstone and centerpiece of our national security in the United States. If Asia is going to be a centerpiece, then Japan, U.S. Japan is at the center of that. I think there's a lot of things we can work on more together. We talked about, the China challenge is not just military, it's what we call, it's not even ideological. Some people call it ideological. It's more ideational. It's not about communism, which is ideological, but ideas. What systems, what norms, what rules, what standards, what idea is going to prevail in the 21st century as the choice of countries around the world, and that will lead governance. Not just internal governance, but global governance. Is it going to be governance systems that are elite-driven, that empower elites, that are opaque, that are corrupt, that just focus on the top tier, and sovereignty means the sovereignty of the elites and what they say? Or is it the sovereignty of people from the bottom up? Is it transparent? Is it accountable systems? Are they inclusive systems of all equally in a conversation, under law? Under rule of law, and not, this is the challenge. And we need to be thinking more about that. I think we could do much more, the U.S. and Japan. We're not doing it enough in the United States, and Japan, I think, is thinking more about it. On the information space globally, of how do we shape the information people get, so that it's about facts and not about propaganda and disinformation. This is challenged, of course, by the technologies that we have. Mostly American technologies, most American platforms, whether it's Facebook or Twitter or X, and of course now TikTok, Chinese. But Chinese have been engaged in an information war on us, on shaping how people around the world understand things. They are actually they're saying that we are a democracy. The Russians and the Chinese have actually put in their joint statement on the eve of the attack on Ukraine, the first article was about democracy. and how they are democracy, and they're now trying to appropriate that term. It can seem laughable to us, but I think we laugh at that at our peril. I think we laugh for a moment, and then we get down to business, where we have to be defining, when we have summits for democracy, what we mean by democracy, what we mean by the norms, what are the things that work for us, whether it's development assistance, norms, standards, or taking on the China narrative about itself around the world, which I think is also, of course, at best, highly selective, and at worst, you can use harder words than that about what China's saying about itself and its so-called success and the reasons for it. So I think we need to be involved on information. We can do a lot more on the norms and values, and I would call it promoting democracy. I think there's a neuralgia in Japan and in the United States too on the term democracy or promoting democracy. It has the idea of Iraq or going there in military and overthrowing governments, which is not the way you support democracy around the world. You have to do it peacefully from the bottom up, empowering civil society, empowering people, promoting norms of transparency and accountability. That's the way you promote those types of things. I think we can think more about how we work on that together, because a more, quote, democratic world actually is a more peaceful world, and a world that works better for our respective interests going forward. So those are a few things to think about.
Thank you. Oka-san, last word before we go to questions.
If I may start with some big ideas and concepts. We have been repeatedly saying that we are opposed to any unilateral attempt to change the status quo by force or coercion in any place in the world. And we are supporting the maintenance of international order, rules-based international order. That's kind of the very big idea behind what we are doing in various places. And speaking of Ukraine, if I may touch upon some of the practical things we are doing our best within our legal and institutional framework to support the efforts on the part of Ukraine to the best of our ability. And most recently, we announced that Japan is going to take part in the IT coalition and the mining coalition. And we are going to strengthen our ties with European countries, NATO and EU in this context. And, we are taking part, for example, the Ukraine contact group meetings led by the U.S. Department of Defense and chaired by Secretary Austin. I personally did have a chance, although online, take part in those meetings. And we would like to keep close contact with those countries of the same objectives so that we could continue to support Ukraine to the maximum extent possible. And perhaps I may touch upon the issues related to the Taiwan Strait a little bit. Our positions have been expressed over and over again, as a matter of fact, and remain unchanged. For example, in the Japan-US 2+2 joint statement, and I quote, the ministers stated that their basic positions on Taiwan remain unchanged and reiterated the importance of maintaining peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait as an indispensable element of security and prosperity in the international community. They encouraged the peaceful resolution of cross-strait issues, and unquote. And, we have been expressing our views that unilateral attempt to change the status quo in South China Sea or in East China Sea is something we are opposed to, and we have to continue to send our messages. And I think it would be very important, or vitally important, for the leaders of PRC to clearly understand our positions, and for us to leave no room for misunderstanding. And for that purpose, continued efforts for signaling or strategic communications would be very important. And we have been doing a lot of high-level meetings among countries, among like-minded countries. And we are conducting exercises and training among relevant countries, for example. But at the same time, a direct dialogue with the Chinese side at all levels will be very important from our viewpoint, because we are trying to send signals to them and strategic communications efforts to make sure that they understand our positions. But we have to continue to have a face-to-face dialogue with them. That would be very important. And for example, in the Shangri-La dialogue in Singapore last year, our defense minister took part in the dialogue there, and the Chinese defense minister was there. And we have a difference of views, certainly. And we have to repeat what we have to repeat. And that does not necessarily mean we can resolve all the issues at one time, but we have to continue to do that to make sure that they understand our positions. And unfortunately, for some reason I'm not aware, the Chinese defense minister just disappeared. And now we have a new defense minister. But we would like to continue to have continue dialogue with them at various levels with them. And so that reflects some of the efforts on our part. But the seminar today starts with what is different from the past and now. But I think there are a lot of things which remain unchanged and constant. The importance of the alliance between Japan and the United States. We are talking about the importance of this alliance and in the context of the Joint Security Declaration of '96. And I quoted one sentence earlier, but this alliance remains the cornerstone of achieving common security objectives for maintaining a stable and prosperous environment. And the similar phrase you can find in, for example, the bilateral joint statement on the occasion of the summit meeting between the two sides. So there may be some differences, but also something remains unchanged and constant. And in order to achieve the common goals I have just mentioned now, it would be important for us to continue our efforts for maintaining this alliance. Alliance management type efforts would be very important. And some people, most notably former Japanese ambassador to our embassy here, Ambassador Kato, used to say, compare those alliance management issues to gardening. We have to continue to do that, and there may be some differences, then we have to attend that kind of things so that we could enhance the effectiveness of our alliance. That's the kind of the things I have in mind when I was working within the Ministry of Defense. Let me stop here.
Let me just say, doing that alliance management is hard. It is like a marriage. I think it was easier to deal with sort of adversaries sometimes. You go across the table and speak and have big sort of idealistic ideas of how you're going to work together and build a different world, whatever. But the day-to-day work of Pentagon folks, and I didn't mention the people that really did the work in '97. I didn't. I was a junior guy when doing the guidelines. I just arrived, literally a few months before, at the Pentagon. But they may be watching. People like Saxacoda, Army Colonel. Jim Armington, is Air Force Lieutenant Colonel. John Hill, we had dinner with last night. These are the people that, behind the scenes, led the effort at the Pentagon and built the relationships and the foundation. Before that was Paul Giara and people like that. They forged these really tight personal relationships with a succession of people like Oka and Shimada and people we know very well, Take Funakoshi, who's now the Deputy Foreign Minister. Right. These people who just come in, and they were just tight partnerships, and you had a lot of differences, and they were hard meetings, and they were frustrating to work on, day-to-day stuff. Like we always say, it's like a marriage. You have to work on it all the time and build trust and have open. But that is the foundation. And the friendship and the trust is the baseline. And now I think that has come to fruition, where we are able to expand that. We preserved it at a certain point. Now it's about expanding it during a time, as I said earlier, when things are really getting real. But I just want to express the appreciation for the alliance management part of how difficult that can actually be on a day-to-day basis, but people are doing it.
Thank you both. think I start moving on to the questions from the participants online and from the floor. So, like some of you alluded to, it was just announced that while Prime Minister Kishida is in town in early April, there will be a U.S. Japan Philippine trilateral. What do you expect out of that? Just off the cuff. I will maybe start with you
With me?
because it's Southeast Asia, and then
Yeah.
Oka-san.
Well, no, I would hope, look, again, I think symbolically it sends a great signal that the U.S. Japan plus, the U.S. Japan is a centerpiece, the Philippines, these are critical nations on the first island chain, as we call it, in East Asia, that are critically important for potential deterrence and a situation over Taiwan, the Taiwan Straits, where U.S. forces need to have sort of free operating ability, potentially with a opening of 5 new bases in northern Philippines. There's a potential to have forces deployed there, or at least materiel deployed there. Again, to have rapid response to show, again, the Chinese that if they do something, there'll be an unacceptable cost. And that the region is being pushed together. They are of common purpose. I think the fact that there are maritime disputes, the ones that are getting the biggest headlines these days are the ones between China and the Philippines, over Second Thomas Shoal and other places, where the Chinese are doing water cannons at resupply boats that the Philippines are pushing out for their sailors. Chinese are just being arrogant and aggressive and saying it's our right. And it's the other side that's provocative because they are defending their interests. It's like a thief saying, you parked in my space, so you're my turf, so I'm going to slash your tires, and you're the provocative one because you shouldn't come on. That kind of stuff has to be responded to, and Marcos is doing that, and to have those three standing together, putting out a statement about peace and stability, about following the 2016 international law decision, according to the law of the sea, that the legal decision against the Chinese position. That's all going to be very symbolic when the Chinese try to play the game of we are taking the high moral road, we are taking, we follow law, rule of law, and we're legally abiding. It shows that there is a very, very severe cost. And I hope what comes out of it is mutual conversation about common defense, about material support, about support in the Pacific Islands, support for democracy, peace and stability throughout, and reaffirmation of that in the Taiwan Straits. And I think the picture typically is the most important as much as anything. There may be a joint statement that says, here's a list of things we might do, but the picture of them together on the lawn in the spring, unfortunately not under the cherry blossoms because they'll be done by then. For those of you who are watching from anywhere else, we're at high peak of cherry blossoms here. We should have done this out in the ellipse, instead of inside the room.
Remember we used to do that?
We used to do that. We do the hanami. But anyway, I think that's the most important, will be that symbolism of the three, but a lot of things that they can speak to.
Oka-san.
Well, I quite agree on the vital importance of the Philippines from our viewpoint as well. And bilaterally, we have been engaged in a lot of interactions with the counterpart of the Philippines. And for example, in the area of bilateral or multilateral exercises with them, our self-defense forces did take part in those kind of exercises in the past. And we did engage in capacity building efforts. In the past, we provided some trainer aircraft of our maritime self-defense force to them. And more recently, there was a contract awarded to a Japanese company to provide warning and control radar for them. And I believe those kind of capacity building efforts would be useful for them to have greater understanding of what kind of security environment they are in, particularly what is happening in the South China Sea and all those kind of things. And, personally, I think it is only natural that for Japan, United States, and the Philippines to work together trilaterally and find out where we can work closely in that trilateral format. And for that matter, I talked about the Shangri-La dialogue last year, and I took part in that one as Vice Minister of Defense for International Affairs. And that was also an important opportunity for senior leaders to get together. And one thing we did in the defense side was, as a matter of fact, Japan, U.S., Australia, and the Philippines quadrilateral defense ministers meeting. There are a lot of common interests and common concepts and views which we share among those countries. And I think the trilateral meeting would be a very important opportunity. Trilateral summit meeting would be a very important opportunity to make sure that we are kind of on the same page with regard to the important issues related to the security in East Asia.
Thank you. So both of you really talked a lot about U.S. Japan Plus. So there's U.S. Japan Australia, U.S. Japan ROK, U.S. Japan India, now U.S. Japan Philippines. And amongst the navies, there's U.S. Japan UK. So what are all these, from your respective point of view, what do these different combination of U.S. Japan Plus brings to the table in terms of stabilizing the regional security? I have to be fair. I have to go to Oka-san first now.
Either way.
Frankly speaking, there are so many frameworks at this moment, not only bilaterally, trilaterally, quadrilaterally, and other types of minilateral as well as multilateral frameworks we are working on. And when I was working in the Ministry of Defense, it's sometimes very difficult what we are discussing in what forum and how we can distinguish the difference between those things. But after I left the government service, it seems to me that it would be very important to, there could be a lot of overlap among those different types of bilaterals, minilaterals, and multilateral engagement. But it would be important to have those kind of things in a multi-layered manner so that we could have a very strong messaging, for example, to China, which we had talked about a lot today. And, we are doing a lot of things, not in an inclusive manner, but we could invite other participants in those kind of frameworks. So those kind of multifaceted and multi-layered approach would be useful to embody the principles of the free and open Indo-Pacific, for example. So, saying this is easy, but doing those people who are doing this is very hard, as a matter of fact. But
right.
I think it would be very important to make extra efforts to do those kind of various types of initiatives.
Yeah. No, I think that's exactly right. And there's a push and pull in Asia. It's different than Europe. I mean, Europe has NATO, Europe has EU, they're collective. There's a neuralgia in Asia of having too much of a collective. Now, I imagine even Japan has that too, but in Korea does. Even when U.S. Japan, Korea, for years they didn't want that, not because we didn't have common interests. Of course, there were problems between Japan and Korea over history, et cetera. But it was also the more you get a grouping, a larger grouping, 4 or 5, the more you antagonize China. And I think people who felt like, it's an Asian NATO is forming, and they'll start getting nervous, and it'll be counterproductive. So countries were like, well, we don't want to be part of anything that's too big, because it looks like we're ganging up, rather than we're having conversations about things together that are affirmative. But I completely agree with you that there's a common agenda among all of that, and it gets to what I said earlier about common standards, norms, values. There should be something affirmative that countries can do together that should be within the realm of acceptable and non-provocative. That is simply saying, we believe in these things. This is what we want the region to look like. And TPP was sort of like that when it came to trade. And that can include China, but you have to then adhere to our standards and our norms, rather than our adhere to your standards and your norms, or they shape or we shape. It's not about being exclusive about countries, it's about being inclusive on norms and values. So I think that's the right balance to take, and I've always believed it shouldn't be about countries, it should be about the norms and standards, but countries have to implement it. So you get together as countries, And the question is, how big is too big in Asia before countries get nervous about it? But I'd love to see the minilateral, which we christened in the '98 East Asia Strategy Report. That idea, I love seeing that now being picked up 25 years later, the idea of minilaterals.
Takes that long, right?
It takes that long for it to be picked up. I think it was an economics term. But I put that in there, minilateral, and then nothing for years, and suddenly minilaterals anyway. But I do think this is a great opportunity, and we should be mixing these more for efficiency, even if individually as a start is important. The second very quick point is that it's easy to put together these things, I guess, symbolically, but you do want them to have real impact. And oftentimes you have a list of things you want to get done, and the doing is the hard part, which is what you said. Then the bureaucrats have to actually do it. And the politicians, the political folks go, oh, look, we had a big success. We had the event on the West Lawn, or whatever else, and now the bureaucrats get this and go, we don't know what to do with this. So it becomes sometimes you can get structure heavy. With a symbolism, we have all these structures, and then at a certain point you go, okay, we have to implement it. AUKUS, then you run into barriers, and then do you actually implement something? And then does it actually have deterrent value? Ultimately, if you're so busy building structures and having events, but at the ground level, you're not actually making it happen. The guidelines, another example, I was kind of joking that the other night, about guidelines say all these things, and it was very hard to get this stuff done. The alliance coordination mechanism was mentioned in '97. It was established last year, right? Last year or the year before. So it took 25 years for actually to happen. So that implementation part of the alliance, the deterrence of structure, deterrence of photo op, deterrence of pushing folks together has an impact, but then you have to get to the ground level. And we'll see how that goes.
So in line of that thinking, one of the areas that the U.S. and Japan, at least especially on the operational side, is quietly but surely more and more focused on how to counter gray zone situations. So what areas should U.S. and Japan prioritize in the strengthening operational cooperation to address those? I think I might go... Maybe Oka-san?
Good. I'm not sure. Give me a moment to think about that. Yeah.
I talked about the national defense strategy a little bit in my area, and one of the approaches is certainly the importance of strengthening the defense cooperation between Japan and the United States. And there could be a lot of important issues right now, and a lot of new ideas are included in our defense strategy, and national security strategy as well as national defense strategy. And perhaps, if I may, just for the sake of example, touch upon one thing is the intention to have a new structure in our operational sphere, which is Japan Joint Operations Command, and we are working towards that. And how we could make most effective use of that kind of system is certainly related to the cooperation between Japan and the United States, certainly. And another example I might touch upon is the introduction of counter-strike capabilities by Japan. And I think there has to be a close coordination with regard to the employment of such capabilities, which is mentioned in our national, defense strategy, I believe. But anyhow, there are a lot of issues we have to think about, and there has been a lot of working level discussion to talk about the issues related to roles, missions, and capabilities between Japan and the United States. So I think as new items, new initiatives come up, there's certainly a lot of efforts required to coordinate fully between Japan and the United States to make the most effective use of those initiatives.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, just quickly, those, I don't figure everybody in the room knows what gray zone means. It's sort of provocative activity short of actual kinetic war. So Chinese are masters at this, of going just short. They push like cannons or using the Coast Guard or even fishing vessels instead of their Navy to push the navies or other fishing vessels around in Asia. So it's what do you do about that? How do you respond to that kind of thing. And I think there's a number of, again, affirming the right to sail where you want to sail. When things happen, to have set up the information sharing, mechanism for the U.S., Japan, Korea. You can do it with the Philippines. Maybe they can get into this. So the maritime domain awareness, so when things happen, that immediately the Philippines don't feel like they are alone. Countries don't feel like they are alone when these things happen. And there can be a rapid political response. It can be rapid or defense response with militaries. I think it's important that countries don't feel like they're just hanging there, because the Chinese like to divide and conquer and take things on bilaterally and pick apart small countries. And those small countries should be bonding together. So that, I mean, material support as needed, as Japan is doing in a lot of ways that are not provocative. You're not giving them fighter jets, but you're giving them things, again, domain awareness, equipment, and things in the Philippines. Give them whatever you need for fishing vessels to know what's going on, radars and things, what's going on in their areas. So the things like that. But this is a really tough challenge, is how do you respond to those gray areas where it's not quite kinetic, it's provocative, and you don't want to escalate or look like you are the provocateur by escalating to a naval confrontation. But those are the types of things that we put forward.
Thank you. One of the things that was remarkable about Japan's national security strategy and the 3 documents, defense strategy and a build-up plan, was Japan's commitment to double its national security-related spending, closer to 2% of its GDP. But as I need to mention, it's like they also focus on fulfilling the personnel level of the self-defense force without, increasing the top line of the self-defense force personnel size. So given that you're not getting, you're not increasing the number of the people in the uniform. What are the areas that those increased defense budget that you foresee? I mean, they're already Japan is already doing some of that. But what are the priority investment area for Tokyo? I mean, obviously, you've been spending copious amount of time talking with Brits and Italians, and that's one of that. But
there are a lot of different kinds of things we have to do, as a matter of fact, and to strengthen our own defense capabilities, and different types of things, including, but not limited to, cross-domain operations, for example. Space and cyber is a new domains we have been talking about for a while now, but certainly we have to make sure that those domains are integrated with the traditional domains so that we could have effective operational capabilities. And also, one lesson at this moment from the conflict or the Ukrainian situations is how we can ensure the sustainability of our operations. And there were a lot of discussions in Tokyo about the importance of having sufficient level of ammunition, for example, and supply chains to support the efforts on the terms of operations. So those are another area we have been working on. And with regard to the sustainability, how we can ensure the resilience of our facilities of the self-defense forces is also another area we are working on again. And we have devoted a lot of resources to rebuild or renovate our facilities. Accumulating those kind of things would certainly lead to significant amount of increase of our defense funds, and we are kind of making our every effort to secure those things. And with regard to the number of SDF personnel, we have not really changed. But we have to make our utmost efforts to make sure that the current force posture would be able to respond to those kind of newly emerging agendas. And at the same time, I might perhaps touch upon the importance of recruitment of personnel for the self-defense forces, even at the current level. as you may be aware of, the Japanese demographic situations are facing certain difficulties. The younger generation is kind of shrinking, and we have to secure adequate amount of personnel, to recruit adequate amount of personnel to support the efforts of the self-defense forces. But with the current situations continuing, it would be very important for us to make extra efforts in this area as well. That does not necessarily mean a huge amount of money, but we have to figure out how to most effectively enhance our efforts for recruitment as well.
So this is a question to both of you. You both touched upon, and you're kind of a symbolism of it, the very tight personal relationship that you forged while you work at the alliance management, which is incredibly hard. But that really doesn't, that alone, the personal relationship amongst the officials doesn't sustain the relationship, right? It really comes to like people to people, private sector. Who you can think of, or which part of the society that you can think of is a very particularly strong advocate of the close relationship between our two countries?
In the United States?
Yeah.
What part of the U.S. is a strong advocate?
Yeah, and then I will probably come to Oka-san as well.
Yeah. Well, again, I mentioned defense as being a leader in that. I think about that. I imagine the business community, there's been a lot of joint activity. It used to be defined, of course, in the 90s it was defined by trade. In the 80s and the 90s, that was our friction point, was trade, and it was dividing us. Today, I think there's more interest and there's more momentum towards joint development of things in joint operating, on technology, whether it's chips or et cetera, et cetera. So I imagine there's a great interest there. But there isn't, there are maybe more now. I'm just reading that fewer people are studying Chinese and few more are studying Japanese than before. You don't have that kind of natural people-to-people or academic interest that you would like in the United States. And people learning Japanese. The JET program still exists. It's still very good, where the Japanese bring over students and people get exposed to Japan. But I rarely run into folks, who are passionate about working in the U.S. Japan alliance, the way they might with, of course, all international relations. It's all going down. But the way, say, in the 2000s, it was the Middle East, or the China. China was obviously very popular. But I'm trying to think where else there would be a driver in the relationship, rather than the U.S. government and just the natural affinity that there is in the society. But maybe you know better.
Well,
it's a challenge.
It's a very important challenge, I think. And when I was hearing the question, the first thing that came to my mind is that it would be important to have a context at a younger generations, perhaps college students, graduate school students, to have a context at various levels would be very important to make sure that they understand each other and what kind of things they have in mind. And, at the outset, I was introduced as a Fletcher graduate. And when I was working as a vice minister in the Ministry of Defense, I did receive a group of Fletcher students. It was called Japan Trek. And they are visiting various places in Japan, including the governments. And they came to my office and had a very interesting discussion, and I think that kind of things would be very useful, and hopefully, I'm not very much familiar with what the Japanese schools are doing, but that kind of, if the Japanese schools and institutions are doing the similar things, that kind of interactions would be very useful, and perhaps at the think tank level, I think there may already be a lot of interactions, including Stimson, I believe, with the Japanese think tanks. But the younger generation think tank folks could have if they could have a lot of interactions among themselves, that would also be very useful, I hope.
I mean, you notice that Congress there's no Japan caucus, there's very rarely a hearing. Now, you don't want to have a hearing on the Hill.
Right.
We used to say you want to avoid that kind of thing happening, because it's usually if there's a problem. So it may, that can be an affirmative thing. But I can't think of even who the champion is now on the Hill when it comes to U.S. Japan alliance. But we need those champions, and I think you're right, just new generations. You have to cultivate it and find resources to ground it. That may be something that hasn't been invested enough by the U.S. government or by institutions like universities. They're all over China with their China wings, but you don't have the same connections to Japan.
You talked about the Congress, and
Yeah.
if I may look at the Japanese Diet. When we were much younger, there's a guy, Diet member, Mr. Moto Shina, who is very much respected by a lot of people, and who is a kind of a champion of the bilateral relationship. And I hope there could be somebody who would be someone like him.
Yeah.
No.
And on our side, it wasn't in Congress. It was Rich Armitage and Joe Nye. And then we were all sort of part of that club or that school. So then Kurt Campbell was kind of a protege of Joe Nye. So Kurt sort of took that on with vigor when he became the DASD for Asia. I was his special assistant in the 1990s. So he became Mr. Japan, and he was promoting that all over the years and still does. But as these folks sort of leave the scene or get older, who is going to rise to become those champions of this alliance? Luckily, though, I think they've left behind a legacy now, and Kurt's leading that now, of making this now part of the fabric of the U.S. government, part of the fabric, just instinctive. We need Asia as a center, U.S. Japan is at the center there, along with Korea, of course, to a degree, but Japan really, as I said earlier, is really at the center of it, hosting our troops and building the relationships, and, really deep partnership. I hope that it's sustainable without having to have the champions, but it is a thin way to maintain an alliance if something goes bad, something goes wrong. You need to build that from the bottom up.
Since you talked about Joe Nye, when he was ASD, Assistant Secretary of Defense, we had that level meeting, and I was a young officer. And when I was listening to what Joe Nye was saying, I thought I was listening to a professor or something.
Yeah.
So actually, we learned a lot during those kind of interactions.
Yeah, he's a remarkable guy.
So, Oka-san, national security strategy and defense strategy talks about a lot of security challenges and threats that Japan faces. Out of those, if you have to rank and stack, what would be what would have the influence on policymakers going forward? So there are a couple of choices. Choice number one, growing Japanese public's awareness of China's growing assertive behavior and ambitious assertive territorial claims. Option number two, North Korea's nuclear threats. Number three, the ever so getting close Russia-China relations and a partnership. We saw that during Operation Tomodachi, Russia and China kind of doing the reconnaissance flight at different parts of Japan when, Japanese Self-Defense Force was really focused on disaster relief and recovery. Or Japan's potential, like a possibility to get sucked into the conflict because of the U.S. role in the region. I'm suspecting that's a vague way of asking Taiwan situation.
So those are the choices.
Yeah.
Or none of the above.
Or none of the above, or you can have all of the above. But.
Listening to those choices, I feel I'm in a position very difficult to. And frankly, it might not be useful to disintegrate various factors in the region. To pick up one thing from them might not be a good way to look at it. All of those things are, in a sense, linked with each other, and how we could address all those challenges in an integrated manner is the huge challenge we are faced with, I think. And obviously, what China is doing is something we are very much looking carefully about. And North Korea launched something, perhaps short-range ballistic missiles this week, even this week. And we have to address all kinds of things all at once, I think. We cannot ignore one thing because another thing is important. So I just can't pick one from those choices, as a matter of fact.
So you're basically saying all of the above. Okay.
I think that's right, but I was just thinking, I think my theory was that the North Koreans were upset that Otani was in Korea. So that's when they launched it. And they were going to, the Dodgers and the Padres played. And I kind of consider this event to be kind of the second of the doubleheader, those who woke up this morning to watch baseball begin out in Seoul and see Darvish and Otani. But I think that's right. I mean, again, the title of this is exactly right, that it's from peace and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific, or even defense of Japan, as Oka-san said, originally was the focus of it, to a global partnership. And it's not just what's happening in the Indo-Pacific. I mean, the Ukraine issue is not directly affecting Japan, but Japan certainly sees it. I mean, it does to a degree, but you see that what happens in Ukraine and Europe can happen in Asia. And there's a sense that all of this is linked. And it's not just China and Russia. I'm not speaking for Japan. I'm just sort of viewing this, at a broad level. I imagine that you've got what we see, Russia, China. We also see North Korea with Iran, with there's a kind of an axis forming there of illiberalism that are trying to shape a different type of world and that's safe for autocrats, it's safe for liberals, and the junior partner in that, of course, is Burma in Myanmar, which is kind of pathetic junior partner with their own problem, but they see themselves as part of that, and that's it has to be an all of the above, I imagine, these days for all of us, because it is linked. And there isn't just a theater here and a theater there. There is a global theater going on that we have to be alert to.
Thank you both. Well, I have like 3 minutes remaining, but for online audience, this gets promptly ended. Ends at the noon. So I think I will give you back 5 minutes of your time today, and for everyone who are here in the audience in person today. But thank you again both. This was actually a dream event that I wanted to do, so I'm so happy that I could do it. And hope you enjoyed the opportunity to reconnect, both here on the stage, but then on the other occasions as well. And then thank you again for those who participated online, those who submitted questions. I'm sorry, I think I probably didn't get like half of it, but I tried my best. But thank you again. And we will, as we are fully into a post-COVID environment, you will start seeing more of this hybrid event coming out of Japan programming. So please stay tuned for that. And thank you again. And thank you to both of your speakers.